The paramedics who arrived at the house on North Carrollwood Drive in Los Angeles on the morning of June 25, 2009, initially assumed they had been called to a hospice, not the home of the most famous entertainer in the history of the world, not the residence of the man whose album Thriller is the best-selling record in the history of recorded music, not the house of the king of pop, whose face was recognized on every continent, whose music had sold over 1 billion copies across 6 decades. They assumed they were responding to the home of a dying patient, a man who had been deteriorating for some time, a man who was expected to go. Michael Joseph Jackson was 50 years old. He was found unresponsive in his bedroom. He weighed 136 pounds. His body contained traces of propofol, lorazepam, midazolam, diazepam, and lidocaine, an anesthetic cocktail that a Harvard Medical School sleep specialist would later testify, in a court of law, was unprecedented in the history of human medicine. He had not experienced a single night of natural REM sleep in at least 60 consecutive days. 60 days. By the expert's own calculation, even if he had not died of an overdose that morning, the absence of real sleep would have killed him within days anyway. The most famous musician who ever lived had been dying of the inability to sleep, not because he lacked medication, because no medication ever gave him the thing he actually needed. This is not a story about drugs. This is a story about what happens when a boy is never allowed to simply be a boy, and what that costs him for the rest of his life. This is a story about a family that made him a star before he understood what a star was, and about the specific kind of loneliness that lives at the exact center of global adoration. This is the story of Michael Jackson, the man behind the sequined glove, the man behind the moonwalk, the man behind the myth, and the life he carried from a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, to the floor of a Holmby Hills mansion where he died in some ways, still trying to get back to a childhood he never had. Stay with me all the way through, because in this documentary I'm going to tell you 4 things about Michael Jackson that most people who know his music, who grew up with his music, who love his music, have never fully understood or connected. I'll tell you about the wound that shaped everything, the one that opened before he could read or write, and that no amount of fame, no amount of money, no amount of sequins or screaming crowds could close. I'll tell you about the architecture of his isolation, how Neverland Ranch was not an eccentric billionaire's toy, but a psychological survival mechanism that became a prison. I'll tell you about the collapse, the years when the world that had worshipped him turned on him with a ferocity that left permanent damage. And the fourth thing I will tell you when we get there. But I want to warn you now, if you leave before the end, you'll miss the truth about Michael Jackson's final weeks that changes the way you understand not just his death, but his entire life. I will tell you when each revelation arrives. Don't go anywhere. Gary, Indiana. Remember that name. Gary, Indiana. Remember that name, because Michael Jackson carried Gary with him every day of his life. He carried it in the way he flinched when a man raised his voice in his presence. He carried it in the way he could not stop performing even when his body screamed for rest. He carried it in the dream he built in the California hills, Neverland, which was nothing more than the childhood Gary never gave him, rebuilt in steel and concrete and carousel lights at the age of 30, August 29, 1958. Michael Joseph Jackson is born into a 2-bedroom house at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, not yet named after his family, just a coincidence that would later feel like prophecy. He is the 7th of 10 children born to Joseph Walter Jackson and Catherine Esther Screws. 10 children, 2 bedrooms. Gary, Indiana, a steel town on the southern lip of Lake Michigan, where the mills run around the clock and the sky is permanently stained by industrial smoke, and where the jobs that once promised a decent life are quietly, steadily beginning to disappear. Joe Jackson is a crane operator at Inland Steel. He works the night shift. He is a man of ferocious ambition and equal ferocity in the methods he uses to impose that ambition on his family. He had been a blues guitarist once, a man who played in a band called the Falcons before the responsibilities of a family absorbed that dream and converted it into something else, into a determination that his children would go where he could not. Catherine Jackson is a Jehovah's Witness, a woman of deep faith and quiet strength, who held the texture of that 2-bedroom house together with a combination of religious conviction and maternal endurance that would impress anyone who understood what she was working with. 9 children, a husband who worked nights and practiced guitar and drove the children hard, a neighborhood that was getting rougher as the steel economy contracted, a religion that set the family apart from the community around them. No Christmas, no birthdays, no holidays that the Jehovah's Witness faith did not recognize. Michael would say this in later years, many times, in different ways. My childhood was taken away from me. There was no Christmas, there were no birthdays. It was not a normal childhood. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing something literal and documented. When other children in Gary were opening presents under Christmas trees, Michael Jackson and his siblings were rehearsing. When other children were playing outside after school, the Jackson boys were running through choreography under their father's supervision in the living room. When other children were discovering who they were through the ordinary failures and confusions of growing up, the embarrassments, the crushes, the free afternoons, the boredom that creativity requires, Michael was working. From the moment Joe Jackson identified his son's musical talent, the domestic clock in that 2-bedroom house was reset around one purpose: getting out of Gary. Getting out of Gary and into the world that existed beyond it. The world that Joe could see on television and that Gary's steel-smoke skies made feel impossibly distant. Joe's method was effective. It was also brutal. Michael later told Oprah Winfrey in their famous 1993 interview that he was so afraid of his father that seeing Joe enter a room made him physically ill. Not metaphorically ill, literally nauseous. He would vomit. He described Joe catching him during rehearsals and the consequences that followed. He said his mother had to intervene, screaming at Joe to stop. "I was so fast he couldn't catch me half the time," Michael said. "But when he would catch me, oh God, it was bad. It was really bad." Joe Jackson responded to these accounts in multiple interviews over the years, with a characteristic equanimity that struck many observers as more troubling than denial. He said he was glad he was tough. He said, look at what he produced. He said everyone spanked their kids, and that his children were loved by the whole world, and that the results justified the methods. Think about what that logic does to a child. Not just the pain of the physical discipline. Children can, in some circumstances, process physical pain, but the message underneath it, the message that your value is conditional, that you are loved in proportion to your performance, that the warmth of the home depends on whether you hit the notes, whether you remember the steps, whether you execute correctly and efficiently and don't disappoint the man at the center of everything. Michael Jackson absorbed that message before he was old enough to have a name for it. He learned before he started school that love was something you earned through performance, that it could be withdrawn, that the person who was supposed to be your unconditional protector was also the person you needed to perform for and feared most. He spent the next 50 years of his life trying to unlearn it. He never quite managed. The boy who could do what no one else could. The talent, though. The talent was real, undeniable, almost unfair in its completeness. Michael Jackson at age 5 was dancing in ways that his older brothers couldn't match. Michael Jackson at age 6 was mimicking vocal runs that professional adult singers had to work for years to master. His elder brother Tito told interviewers later that there were moments in their childhood rehearsals when even Joe Jackson, a man not easily moved to wonder by anything, would stop what he was doing and just watch the small boy in the middle of the floor. Joe formed the Jackson Brothers in the early 1960s, initially with Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine. When Michael and Marlon were old enough, they joined, and the group became the Jackson 5. Joe drove them through the Midwest talent circuit, the bars, the clubs, the talent shows, the theater stages in places like Chicago and Cincinnati and Gary itself. They performed in venues that were not designed for children, at hours that were not designed for children, in conditions that were not designed for children. Michael was the frontman. Not because Joe designated him, because it was impossible to watch the group and look anywhere else when Michael was performing. He moved as if the music lived inside his body and was simply expressing itself outward. He sang with a voice that had no business being in a 9-year-old's chest, a voice with feeling in it, with longing in it, with a quality of emotional truth that audiences recognized instinctively, even when they couldn't name it. By 1968, the group had been signed to Motown Records after an audition that Motown president Berry Gordy later described as one of the most impressive he had ever witnessed. They relocated to Los Angeles. They had hits: I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There. 5 #1 singles in a row on the Billboard Hot 100. In the early 1970s, the Jackson 5 were among the most popular acts in the world. Michael was 11 years old when the first single charted, 12 when they became stars, 13 when his face was on the cover of national magazines and girls were writing him letters by the thousands, and his image was on lunchboxes and t-shirts and posters on bedroom walls across the country. 13 years old, and already incapable of an ordinary public life. He could not go to school like other children. He was tutored on sets and in studios. He could not walk down a street in Los Angeles without being recognized, followed, touched. He could not make a normal friend. Every relationship he tried to form was complicated by the asymmetry of his fame, by the question that always hung in the air. Did you want to know me, or did you want to know Michael Jackson? He could not fall in love like other teenagers. He could not fail like other teenagers. Fail a test, fail to impress a girl, fail to make the team, fail quietly and privately in all the ways that are necessary for a young person to discover who they actually are. Every moment of his adolescence was public. Every developmental experience that should have been private was observed, documented, amplified. Michael later said, "I never had the chance to do the fun things that kids do. Sledding, have pillow fights, just have fun. I miss that, and I feel I compensate for that in my work." He compensated. He always compensated. Work was the only language the family and the industry had taught him. Work was the currency that bought safety. Work was the proof that he deserved to exist. And so he worked, with a dedication that was breathtaking and a hunger that never quite seemed satisfied, because what he was actually working toward, the childhood, the normalcy, the unconditional love that didn't require a spotlight, was not something any amount of work could purchase. The break and the rebirth. By the late 1970s, Michael Jackson's solo career had begun to emerge alongside his work with his brothers. His 1979 album, Off the Wall, produced in collaboration with Quincy Jones, sold over 20 million copies worldwide, produced 4 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100, and established Michael as a solo force entirely separate from the Jackson 5. It was not enough. Or rather, it was everything, and it felt like nothing. "I cried a lot," Michael said about the night of the 1980 Grammy Awards, when Off the Wall, despite its commercial and critical success, won only 1 Grammy, Best R&B Vocal Performance. He felt it should have been recognized more broadly. It seemed like a slight, or maybe just a limit, a ceiling placed over what a young black artist from Gary, Indiana could achieve in a white-dominated industry. He told Quincy Jones, "Next time, it's going to be undeniable." November 30th, 1982. Thriller is released on Epic Records of CBS Columbia. It is Michael Jackson's 6th studio album. Nothing about its initial release suggests what is about to happen. The first single, a duet with Paul McCartney called The Girl Is Mine, is pleasant, well-crafted, and slightly unremarkable, almost as if the album is hiding what's inside it. Then, in January 1983, Billie Jean hits radio stations across the country, and something shifts in the air of American pop culture that has never quite shifted back. The bass line alone, played before the song even begins, before a single word, before the first chorus, that bass line reaches into the room and grabs hold of something in the listener that operates below conscious thought. And then the voice, and then the story, the dangerous woman, the paternity accusation, the cool paranoia of a man who knows he is being watched. It was unlike anything on the radio. It was unlike anything that had come before it. On March 25, 1983, Michael Jackson appeared on the television special Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever, to perform Billie Jean alongside a medley with his brothers. He wore a single white glove and a black hat, and at a specific moment in the performance, he slid backward across the stage on the balls of his feet in a move that seemed to defy the basic physics of human locomotion, the moonwalk. He had been working on that move for months, studying street dances, refining the mechanics, understanding the illusion. The audience at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium went completely silent for a fraction of a second. That specific silence that happens when a crowd collectively cannot believe what it has just seen, and then erupted. Fred Astaire reportedly called Michael the following morning and told him he had watched the performance and could not sleep. The scale of what Thriller became is difficult to describe in terms that retain their meaning. The album sold 1 million copies a week in 1983. By 1984, it had sold over 22 million copies, making it the fastest-selling album in history at that time. It went on to become the best-selling album of all time, with estimates ranging between 66 and 70 million copies sold worldwide. At the 1984 Grammy Awards on February 28th, Michael Jackson won 8 Grammy Awards in a single evening, a record that stood for decades. He arrived with his entire family, wearing military-style regalia and sunglasses, and collected award after award from a room full of the most powerful people in the music industry, who were now unambiguously standing in his presence. He was 25 years old. He was, by any measurable standard, the most famous entertainer on earth. He went home that night to Havenhurst, the Jackson family compound in Encino, California, and, by multiple accounts from people who were there, could not sleep. Revelation number 1. The fame multiplied the wound. It did not heal it. Here comes the first of the 4 things I promised you. Pay very close attention. There is a version of the Michael Jackson story that most people carry. The boy from Gary who had a hard beginning, but who found his talent and rose to the very top of the world, and whose problems came later, from the corruptions of celebrity and the pressures of the spotlight. In this version, the childhood was the foundation. The fame was the house built on top of it. The problems were the result of too much success, too much money, too much of everything. That version is backwards. The fame did not create Michael Jackson's wounds. It magnified wounds that were already there, already deep, already structural. And here is the specific mechanism by which it did so. A child who grows up in an environment where love is conditional, where it is earned through performance and withdrawn when performance disappoints, learns a specific lesson about the world. The lesson is, I am not inherently lovable. I am lovable for what I do. My worth is my output. My value is my function. This is a wound, and the cure for this wound, the only genuine cure, is an experience of love that exists independent of performance. Love that says, I see you when you're failing. I see you when you're ordinary. I see you when you are tired and broken and have nothing left to give. And I love you then, exactly as much as when you were perfect. Michael Jackson needed that experience. Every human being needs that experience. Instead, what fame gave him was the most enormous possible confirmation of exactly the wrong thing. 60 million fans, screaming crowds in every country, letters by the sack, girls fainting at the sight of him, record sales that broke every instrument used to measure record sales. All of it, every last bit of it, conditional on the performance, on Michael Jackson being Michael Jackson. Not on the boy from Gary, on the spectacle. People everywhere love Michael Jackson, he said in one interview. And then, a beat later, quietly, but does anyone love me? Does anyone love me? Not Michael Jackson. Me. He knew the difference. He felt the difference. The fame had given him the world's attention and had made the thing he most needed, to be known and loved without the performance, without the glove and the hat and the moonwalk, feel farther away than it had felt in Gary. Because at least in Gary, in the poverty and the fear and the 2-bedroom house, his mother, Catherine, had loved him. Not perfectly, not without complication. She was managing a difficult husband, 10 children, a religion, and a 2-bedroom house. But her love was for the child, not the talent. For Michael, not the performer. Once the performance became everything, the boy disappeared inside it. And the older he got, the harder it became to find him. Neverland, the childhood that money could build. In 1988, Michael Jackson purchased a 2,700-acre property in the Santa Ynez Valley in California near Santa Barbara. He paid just under $20 million for it. He renamed it Neverland Valley Ranch. The name was not a casual choice. I totally identify with Peter Pan, the lost boy from Neverland, Michael said explicitly, Because Peter Pan represents something very special to me. His figure has to do with everything that is childhood, the desire to remain a child forever. He built on that property a full amusement park with carnival rides, a zoo with giraffes, elephants, orangutans, and a 2-ton Burmese python, a movie theater with an 80-seat screening room, a train station with a real locomotive, a private arcade, flower gardens that required a staff of 40 to maintain, a lake with swans, a floral clock, bumper cars, a Ferris wheel, a water wheel, a candy shop, a fire station, a baseball diamond. He built on that property everything that Gary, Indiana had never given him, and that the touring circuit and the record studios and the Grammy stages had consumed the years when he should have been experiencing it. It was, simultaneously, one of the most extraordinary personal estates ever constructed, and one of the most heartbreaking structures ever built. Because what Michael Jackson was building on that California hillside, what he was spending $20 million and an army of contractors to create, was a life-sized monument to absence, to the specific absence of a normal boyhood, to the childhood that had been extracted from him before he was old enough to miss it. "I wanted to be a child," he said simply in the 1993 Oprah interview. "I wanted to climb trees. I wanted to have fun. I missed so much of that." He invited children to Neverland. Sick children. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Children he connected with through his charitable work and his genuine documented love of children as a population. He watched movies with them, rode the rides with them, ate candy with them. He said he felt more comfortable with children than with adults because children saw through the performance to the person, and because they reminded him of the thing that had been taken from him. The property absorbed his life completely. He slept irregular hours, woke in the middle of the afternoon, moved through the estate at 3 in the morning with a childlike freedom that he could only access in the deep night when the staff was asleep and the gates were closed and the world was outside. The world was always outside. That was the point. Inside Neverland, as a private documentary about the estate would later describe it, movement beyond its borders became optional. The outside world remained present through business and obligation, but its physical intrusion was reduced. The ranch absorbed daily life so completely that leaving became unnecessary. And then leaving became uncomfortable. And then leaving became something he did only when he had no choice. But here is what Neverland couldn't do. No matter how elaborately it was constructed, it couldn't give him what was actually missing. Because what was missing wasn't a carousel or a movie theater or a zoo. What was missing was time. The actual time of childhood. The years that had been used for rehearsal and performance and recording. Those years were gone. And no amount of money, not 20 million, not 100 million, not everything Michael Jackson ever earned, could manufacture years that had already been spent. The rides were real. The animals were real. The candy was real. The thing they were meant to replace was irreplaceable. Neverland was a fortress against the world and a monument to a wound. And like all fortresses, it eventually became a trap. Revelation number 2. The man the world saw and the man who actually existed were barely the same person. This is the second revelation. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, something had happened to Michael Jackson's public image that has no precise parallel in the history of celebrity culture. He had become so famous, so completely and entirely famous, so thoroughly converted into an icon, that ordinary human perception of him ceased to function normally. People projected onto him. They made him whatever they needed him to be. The industry made him the king of pop, a title that came with its own set of expectations and demands. The media made him a figure of spectacle and gradually of mystery. Tabloids pursued him with an intensity that required him to respond with equal intensity of privacy, which then generated more tabloid interest in what he was hiding. And Michael, who had been performing since before he could ride a bicycle, understood this dynamic and tried to use it. He cultivated mystery. He showed up to public events with a surgical mask. He wore the single white glove, which had begun as a way to cover a skin condition, the vitiligo that was gradually depigmenting his skin, a condition that is documented and medically verified, and that Michael himself confirmed in the 1993 Oprah interview as a diagnosis he had carried for years. The glove became a symbol, and the symbol obscured the man, and the man The private, frightened, lonely man underneath the performance disappeared deeper into the symbol with every passing year. His bodyguards from the last years of his life, Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard, who were with him virtually 24 hours a day for the final 2.5 years, wrote a book about what they witnessed. And what they witnessed, they said, was almost entirely at odds with the Michael Jackson of tabloid narrative. The private Michael Jackson, they said, was a man who helped his children with their homework every morning, who got them dressed for school and made them breakfast, who turned down an invitation to go backstage and meet Prince at a concert because his children were still up, and he knew they wouldn't sleep until he got home, so he went home. He was present for everything, in every way, they wrote. It's safe to say that being a father was the most important thing in Mr. Jackson's life at that point, more than recording, performing, you name it. The Michael Jackson of the tabloids and the Michael Jackson of his bedroom and his children's school mornings were so different that they seem, on paper, to be describing two separate people. One is an alien figure, mysterious and strange, incapable of normal human interaction. The other is a father who declined a meeting with a peer he deeply admired because his kids needed to go to sleep. Both were real. That is the point. Both were real, and the distance between them was not a lie. It was a survival strategy. The private Michael, the father in the pajamas, the man who watched movies and ate popcorn with his children, could only exist because the public Michael, the icon, the performance, the sequined mythology, kept the world at a manageable distance. But the distance that protected him also isolated him, completely, structurally. The same walls that kept the tabloids out kept genuine human connection in. He lived for most of his adult life in a world populated largely by employees and people who needed something from him. Finding a person who related to him as an ordinary human being, who didn't want a piece of the icon, who wasn't going to sell the story afterward, who was capable of seeing Michael without the myth. This became for him one of the central and essentially unsolvable problems of his existence. He was a sad, lonely figure, his bodyguards said plainly in their book. He longed for a more normal life. The man who had sold 1 billion records. The man whose name was printed in every newspaper in the world. The man who had danced on the stage of Motown 25 in front of 47 million television viewers and made Fred Astaire call him the next morning in astonishment. Sad, lonely, longing for ordinary life. That sentence is not a paradox if you understand what Gary, Indiana took from him before he could take anything from it. 1993. The year the ground split open. For much of the 1980s, Michael Jackson had managed the complexity of his life, the fame, the isolation, the psychological weight of the childhood loss, with something resembling equilibrium. The output was extraordinary. The Bad Album and the Bad World Tour, the most commercially successful tour in history to that point. The Dangerous Album. The expanding business empire, including his acquisition of the Beatles catalog through ATV Music Publishing in 1985 for $47 million, a deal that made him one of the most powerful figures in the music industry by virtue of owning the songs that defined the Beatles' legacy. He had money, he had creative control, he had Neverland, which he believed was his sanctuary. He had, or believed he had, a wall between his private life and the world that could hold. In 1993, that wall came down, and what came through it destroyed something in Michael Jackson that never fully rebuilt. Jordan Chandler was a 13-year-old boy whose acquaintance with Michael Jackson had begun through a chance meeting in 1992. Jackson befriended the family, as he had befriended many families with children over the years, a pattern consistent with his stated desire for connection with young people who saw him without the weight of his celebrity. In August 1993, Jordan Chandler's father, Evan Chandler, retained an attorney and alleged that Michael Jackson had engaged in inappropriate conduct with his son. The allegations went public. Los Angeles Police Department detectives opened a criminal investigation. The investigation was devastating for Michael Jackson in ways that went beyond even the legal jeopardy. What the allegations did was take the most vulnerable, most private, most psychologically significant aspect of who he was, his complicated relationship with childhood, his identification with children, his Neverland and his Peter Pan declarations, and place it under the harshest possible light, reframed in the worst possible terms. Jackson maintained his innocence throughout. In January 1994, a civil lawsuit brought by the Chandler family was settled out of court. The reported total settlement amount was approximately $15 million. Jackson's attorneys stressed consistently that the settlement was not an admission of guilt, and that Jackson had settled to avoid the distraction of prolonged litigation on his ability to work. The criminal investigation was ultimately closed in September 1994 after the Chandlers declined to cooperate with prosecutors, leaving the case without a complaining witness. No charges were filed. But the damage was not primarily legal. It was psychological, and it was permanent. The Pepsi endorsement deal, a relationship that had defined Jackson's commercial presence for a decade, was cancelled. His public image, which had been protected for years by the sheer magnitude of his talent and the goodwill of his audience, had been fundamentally altered. The questions that the allegations raised, about who Michael Jackson really was, about what actually went on inside Neverland, could not be unasked. They lodged in the public consciousness and stayed there. Jackson's health deteriorated sharply. During the 1993 Dangerous World Tour, he canceled the remaining dates, citing addiction to painkillers, a dependency that had begun after a scalp surgery required following an incident in 1984 in which his hair caught fire during a Pepsi commercial shoot. He entered a rehabilitation program. He emerged from that period looking, to those who knew him, like a man who had experienced something that rearranged his interior architecture. He was more withdrawn, more suspicious, less willing to trust. The paranoia that had always existed at the edges of his consciousness, the legacy of growing up with a father whose love was conditional, of being surrounded since childhood by people who wanted something from him, had grown. The specific paranoia of a person who believes, with some justification, that the world can choose to destroy you without warning. Perhaps you have experienced something like this. Perhaps you have been accused of something, at work, in a relationship, in a community, that you knew in your bones was wrong, and you watched as people who claimed to know you accepted the accusation, or at least kept a careful distance from the denial. Perhaps you know what it feels like to have your character become a question mark in the minds of people who previously seemed certain of it. That specific loneliness, the loneliness of the person who has been publicly accused, is different from ordinary loneliness. It has an aggressive quality. It makes the inside of every room feel contested. It makes trust feel like a risk that the evidence suggests you cannot afford. For Michael Jackson, it never fully went away. The marriage, the children, and the things that actually held him in 1994, Michael Jackson married Lisa Marie Presley, the only child of Elvis Presley, herself no stranger to the specific experience of being a famous person's child and all that entails. The marriage lasted approximately 2 years, ending in divorce in 1996. Lisa Marie would say later that she had genuinely loved him, that the relationship was real and complicated, that she had believed she could help him, and that the specific kind of help he needed turned out to be beyond what any one person could provide. Those who observed the relationship closely noted that both of them had grown up inside a version of this story. The story of a father consumed by the machinery of fame, the story of a child watching that consumption from the inside, and that what they recognized in each other may have been as much a shared wound as a shared life. He married again in 1996. Debbie Rowe, a nurse who had worked for his dermatologist, agreed to have children with him and became the mother of his first 2 children, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., known as Prince, born in February 1997, and Paris Michael Catherine Jackson, born in April 1998. The marriage ended in 1999. A third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, later known as Blanket, now going by Biggie, was born via surrogate in 2002. Whatever one says about the unconventional circumstances of his children's births, whatever one makes of the famous images of Blanket briefly held over a hotel balcony railing in Berlin, an incident Jackson immediately acknowledged was a mistake, the testimony of the people who were closest to him in his final years is consistent on one point. Michael Jackson's children were the center of his existence, completely, without qualification. Being a father was the most important thing in Mr. Jackson's life at that point, more than recording, performing, you name it, his bodyguards wrote. The kids came first no matter what. He homeschooled them, or arranged their schooling himself. He taught them to be curious about the world, history, science, music, art. He made them wear masks in public not, as tabloids suggested, from eccentricity, but from a documented rational fear rooted in his own experience. He did not want them to become recognizable, because he knew with precision what recognizability had cost him, and he was determined that they would have the childhood he never had. The irony, and it is a painful one, is that in trying to give his children the ordinary life he had been denied, he was forced to create another version of the isolation that had defined his own. Private schools, private security, private everything. The wall that protected them also enclosed them. The childhood he gave them was safer than his had been, and freer than his had been, and almost entirely separate from the world that would have pursued them the moment it knew their faces. He could protect them from the world he had experienced. He could not live normally in that world himself, and so the protection he built for them was, simultaneously, a further version of his own prison. The father who made breakfast every morning. The man who turned down prints backstage to get home to his kids. The person who, according to everyone who saw him in those private moments, was at his most genuinely, openly human when he was with his children. This person was the real Michael Jackson, as real as anything that happened on stage, and he was accessible only inside the walls. The 2005 trial and the years after. In November 2003, a documentary by British journalist Martin Bashir, filmed over 14 months with Michael Jackson's cooperation, aired on television. It showed Jackson with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Arviso, speaking about their friendship, discussing his affection for children with a frankness that created, in the broader public, a reaction of profound discomfort. Shortly afterward, Jackson was arrested and charged with 7 counts of child molestation and 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent. The trial lasted from January to June 2005. It was conducted in Santa Maria, California, and it was one of the most heavily covered criminal proceedings in American history. Every day of testimony was dissected by the global media. The jury deliberated for 7 days. On June 13, 2005, Michael Jackson was acquitted on all 14 counts. Not found not guilty on some counts, acquitted on all of them. The jury voted unanimously in his favor on every single charge. He walked out of that courthouse and flew back to Neverland. And then he left the country. He spent the years between 2005 and 2009 largely outside the United States, in Bahrain initially, where he was the guest of a member of the Bahraini royal family, then in Ireland, then in Las Vegas. He brought his children. He moved quietly, tried to exist without spectacle, tried to find a version of ordinary life in cities where he was famous but not mythological. His bodyguards documented this period with a specificity that is both moving and painful. He took his children to a grocery store in Las Vegas. He wore a disguise, a beard and a hat. He walked the aisles, looked at the products, bought things. He came back to the car and was excited, genuinely excited, because he had gone to a grocery store, because he had done something that every adult in America does without a second thought. And for him, it was an adventure so unusual, it was worth discussing for the rest of the day. He longed for a more normal life, his bodyguard said. That sentence contains more tragedy than most eulogies. He was broke, or close to it. The Neverland property, which had been used as collateral for loans, was in foreclosure. His debts were estimated at the time at over $300 million. The music empire, the real estate, the 2 decades of spending on a scale that required a permanently running cash machine, it had outrun the income. The income had fallen sharply in the years since 1993 and had not fully recovered. The AEG touring deal was, in some significant part, a financial necessity. He needed the money that 50 shows at London's O2 Arena would generate. But here is what the money doesn't explain. His bodyguards said he was excited to perform again, that he was animated, talking about the show, about the production, about what it was going to be. That part of what the This Is It tour represented was the thing that performing had always represented for him. The one place where the gap between the boy from Gary and the king of pop temporarily closed, where the performance and the person inhabited the same body without conflict, where the crowd's love and his own need to be loved briefly, perfectly aligned. He had told his choreographer, the only thing he didn't like about touring was all the doctors. The irony of that sentence is almost too much to hold. Revelation number 3. He was already disappearing before June 25th. Here comes the third revelation. Emails sent internally at AEG Live, the promoter behind This Is It, in the weeks before Jackson's death, described a situation that was deeply alarming to those close to the production. AEG's CEO, Randy Phillips, wrote in one email that Jackson was locked in his room drunk and despondent the night before the tour announcement press conference. In the same email, "I am trying to sober him up," and "He is an emotionally paralyzed mess, riddled with self-loathing and doubt, now that it is showtime." At the same press conference, the public saw Michael Jackson walk onto the stage at the O2 Arena in London and raise his fist, and the crowd erupted. He was smiling. He looked in that moment like a comeback, like the king returning. Both of these things, the man in the email and the man on the stage, were true simultaneously. This was always how it worked with Michael Jackson. The performance could coexist with devastation in a way that was, by this point, decades old. He had learned to perform through pain before he was old enough to understand what pain was. The muscle memory of performing when broken was the most reliable thing in his life. But behind the closed doors of his rented mansion in Holmby Hills, the insomnia was catastrophic. Michael Jackson had struggled with sleep for most of his adult life. The anxiety, the hypervigilance that is a common response to a childhood of unpredictable fear, the lifestyle that operated entirely outside of normal circadian patterns, all of this made natural sleep difficult. He had been using prescription medication to sleep for years. A doctor named Neil Quinn later testified that Jackson had asked her for propofol, the powerful surgical anesthetic, to help him sleep as far back as a decade before his death. She had refused. She told him that the sleep you get under anesthesia is not real sleep, not restorative sleep. Jackson responded by telling her that the time under anesthesia was the best sleep he had ever had. He said it was the best sleep he had ever had, not because it was genuinely restorative. Because under anesthesia, the mind stops running. The performances stop. The accusations stop. The memories of Gary stop. The fear of the father stops. The screaming crowds and the tabloid cameras and the trial transcripts and the financial statements and the $300 million in debt, all of it stops. For a few hours, there was silence. Dr. Conrad Murray, who had been hired in May 2009 at a reported salary of $150,000 per month to be Michael Jackson's personal physician during the This Is It rehearsals, began administering nightly propofol infusions to help Jackson sleep. He did this in Jackson's bedroom, which is not a medical facility. He did this without the monitoring equipment that the administration of a powerful surgical anesthetic requires. He did this every night for 60 consecutive nights. According to Dr. Charles Cheisler of Harvard Medical School, who testified during the subsequent manslaughter trial, Michael Jackson may have been the first human being ever to go 60 days without experiencing REM sleep. The consequence of this, of 60 days of propofol infusions masquerading as sleep while providing none of the neurological restoration that sleep actually accomplishes, was a body and a mind in an advanced state of physiological collapse. Dr. Cheisler testified that even if Jackson had not died of an overdose on June 25th, the sleep deprivation alone would likely have killed him before his 80th day of propofol treatments. He was already disappearing. Slowly, biochemically, irreversibly, in the bedroom of a rented house, while 50 concerts at the O2 Arena waited for him in London, while his children slept down the hall, while his name was on billboards across the world, and tickets to see him were changing hands on the secondary market for $2,000 each. He was already disappearing. The last rehearsal, the last day. On June 24, 2009, Michael Jackson attended a rehearsal for This Is It at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. Film footage of that rehearsal, which AEG had been recording for a documentary, shows him performing Earth Song with a full production. He is thin. He is moving carefully, with less physicality than in his prime. But the voice is there. The commitment is there. When the music swells in Earth Song, in the gospel choir swell of the bridge, his eyes close, and he is somewhere else. Somewhere that is not the rented house, or the financial statements, or the 30 years of accumulated wounds. He is in the music. People who were present at that rehearsal said it was moving. that he was present in a way that had been inconsistent during the weeks leading up to it, that something about that last night had a quality of not goodbye, because no one was thinking in those terms, but of arrival, as if he had gotten through the uncertainty and was finally here, in the thing he understood, doing the thing he had always been able to do regardless of what everything else was doing. He left the Staples Center around midnight. He went home. Dr. Conrad Murray arrived later. He administered propofol, as he had been doing every night for 2 months. He was in the room, monitoring. At some point in the morning, he stepped away briefly. When he came back, Michael Jackson was not breathing. Murray initiated resuscitation. He called others in the house. The paramedics were called at 12:21 p.m. When they arrived and saw the figure on the bed, their initial assessment, based on his appearance, his condition, the degree of deterioration in his body, was that they had been called to a hospice patient. At 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was transported to UCLA Medical Center. At 2:26 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter on November 7, 2011. He served approximately 2 years in prison. Revelation number 4. What killed? Michael Jackson was not the propofol. Here it is. The fourth revelation. The one that changes the frame of everything that came before. The medical cause of death was propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication, ruled a homicide by the Los Angeles County coroner. Conrad Murray was legally responsible for the administration of the substance that stopped Michael Jackson's breathing. That is a fact. It is documented, adjudicated, and concluded. But the propofol did not appear from nowhere. It was the last link in a chain that reached back to a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana in 1958. Michael Jackson needed propofol because he could not sleep. He could not sleep because his nervous system had been, for 50 years, in a state of low-grade emergency, shaped by a childhood of conditional love, disciplined by fear, demanded of from before he was old enough to consent to being demanded of, and then given to the world in a transaction that never ended and never truly compensated him for what it cost. He could not sleep because the mind that runs the same fears in loops, am I loved for who I am or only for what I do, does not sleep easily. The mind that learned before kindergarten that the withdrawal of affection was a constant possibility does not rest easily. The mind that spent decades navigating the gap between the icon the world needed and the man who actually existed behind it, that mind had not found quiet in 50 years. He told the doctor who refused him propofol a decade before his death that the time under anesthesia was the best sleep he had ever had. That statement is the most heartbreaking sentence in this entire story, because what it means is that the only way Michael Jackson could find peace, the only way the performance could stop, even temporarily, the only way the fear and the fame and the wound and the loneliness could go quiet, was by chemically rendering himself unconscious. He was not self-destructive in the way the word is commonly used. He was desperate for the silence that had been denied him since before he could speak. The silence of the ordinary, of the afternoon with nothing scheduled, of the night that doesn't carry the weight of 60 million expectations. He built Neverland to find it. He had children to find it. In the quiet morning of making breakfast and arguing about who left whose toys on the stairs. He sang about it in every form that music can take. The longing for love that doesn't ask anything back. The hope that somewhere, in some version of reality, the lost boy gets to rest. He never quite got there. But he came close, in the evenings in Las Vegas when his kids were in bed, and he sat in the quiet house in pajamas and watched a movie he'd seen 100 times. Close, in the moments at Neverland, when the gates were locked and the world was outside, and he walked through the carnival lights at 3 in the morning, a grown man on a property built like a playground, looking for himself in the shapes he remembered. Gary, Indiana. That is where this story begins and where it returns. Not because Gary is where Michael Jackson was born, but because Gary is where the boy who would become Michael Jackson was told, in every way that a household communicates its truths, that his worth was his performance. He never stopped performing. He performed through abuse and allegations and trial and exile. He performed through financial collapse and the loss of the home he had built as a monument to what had been taken. He performed on June 24, 2009, through a body that Harvard's sleep science said was already dying. And somewhere in all of that, the boy from Gary, who had never been allowed to be ordinary, who had never had the birthday parties or the Christmas mornings or the aimless summer afternoons, that boy kept looking for the thing that performing could promise but never deliver, the thing that requires not a stage, but silence. What the music carries. When you listen to Man in the Mirror, really listen to it, past the familiarity, past the radio play, past the years of it being in every movie montage about self-improvement, what you hear is someone asking a question that he was asking himself every day, from Gary to Holmby Hills. Who am I when the performance stops? What is left of me when the music stops? The answer he kept trying to construct, through Neverland and through fatherhood and through the gospel songs he returned to constantly, was, the boy is still there. He was always there. Underneath the glove and the hat and the moonwalk and the mythology and the 60 million fans and the $300 million in debt, the boy who wanted Christmas morning is still there, still looking for it. Michael Jackson sold over 1 billion records. His influence on popular music, on dance, on visual production, on what a music video could be, on what a performer could do with a stage, is measurable in virtually every pop artist working in the decades since. You don't get to Beyoncé, to Justin Timberlake, to Chris Brown, to Bruno Mars, to virtually any large-scale pop performer of the last 30 years, without going through Michael Jackson. His fingerprints are structural. He won 18 Grammy Awards, including the 8 in a single night in 1984. He received the Grammy Legend Award and the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. He holds multiple Guinness World Records. Thriller remains the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. And he spent the last night of his life unable to fall asleep without an anesthetic. These two facts live inside each other. The achievement and the wound are the same person. The king of pop and the boy from Gary with the conditional love and the father who made him vomit with fear. Same person, same body, same life. The world saw the sequins. Michael Jackson saw the 2-bedroom house. His children, Prince, Paris, and Biggie, grew up after his death, mostly outside of public life, and have gradually, in their own ways, found their way toward the world. Paris has spoken about her father with tenderness and complexity. Prince has pursued business and philanthropy. Biggie has kept largely private. They are, by all accounts that exist of them, thoughtful, grounded people, which is itself a testament to those quiet mornings in Las Vegas, to the father who made breakfast and turned down backstage access to Prince because his children needed to be in bed. He gave them as much as he possibly could within the constraints of his existence, the childhood he never had. Not perfectly, not without complication or consequence, but with the full force of whatever love remained available to a man who had been taught, before he was old enough to understand the teaching, that love was something you earned. It was, in the end, the most genuine performance of his life. And unlike every other performance, unlike the moonwalk on Motown 25, unlike the 8 Grammys in a single night, unlike the 1 billion records sold, this one asked for no audience. Gary, one more time. 2300 Jackson Street, Gary, Indiana, is still there. The house where Michael Jackson was born is a small structure with a concrete porch and a chain-link fence. It sits in a neighborhood that has continued to struggle in the decades since the steel industry left, that has been marked by disinvestment and the particular kind of quiet that settles over places that the economy has abandoned. People visit it. They travel from across the country and across the world to stand in front of that small house and try to feel the connection between this place and the 1 billion records and the moonwalk and the Neverland carousel and the June morning in Holmby Hills. The connection is this: a boy lived here, and a family asked everything of him before he could ask anything of himself. And he gave it, all of it, everything that was in him, without reservation, for 50 years. He gave it in the recordings and the performances and the 30-foot robot that opened his history tour. He gave it in the quiet mornings with his children. He gave it in the Neverland rides that he built for children who reminded him of what he had been. He gave it all. And the one thing he couldn't give, couldn't perform or produce or spend his way into, was the ordinary life, the unremarkable Tuesday, the grocery run, the sleeping in, That was the life he wanted. A man who had everything, in search of something so simple that most people never notice they have it. That is fame and shadows. The space between the legend and the life. The distance between what the world sees and what the person carries. If something in Michael Jackson's story reached you, if you recognize something in the gap between the person who performs and the person who just wants to rest, then you are exactly who this channel exists for. Stories like his are everywhere. Famous names, human wounds. We tell them here with care and honesty, and the understanding that behind every myth is a person who woke up frightened sometimes, and who needed, like all of us, something that the spotlight was never designed to provide. We'll keep telling them. Stay with us.